So welcome, colleagues, if you're joining on the recording, and hi, colleagues, if you're here with us live. Thank you so much for joining us today in what is our third session of our Beyond the Reading series for the Research with International Student Network. If you're here live today, as I said a few minutes ago, it'd be lovely if you can say hello in the chat. Just let us know where you're joining from. Lovely to see who's in the room. If you are, I see a lot of familiar names, but if you're new to RIS, just a quick introduction that we're a network of scholars whose work includes international students as participants or co-researchers, and generally we take a critical lens towards redeveloping more ethical research and practice with international students. If we haven't had the chance to meet before, my name is Jenna Mittelmeier, and I'm one of the co-founders and organizers of the network. If you would like to become more involved with RIS in the future, I'll put some links in the chat in just a moment where you can sign up to our mailing lists or give us a follow on LinkedIn. But this series that we're here today for is called Beyond the Reading, where each month we are spending a little bit of time in conversation with authors who have written these really valuable critical publications within our field, with the aim of kind of talking to them about the stories and intentions behind their paper. So this is the third conversation that we've had, and the recordings from previous sessions are all available on our YouTube channel, which I'll put the link in the chat for in a moment as well. After today, we've got one more session planned in December with Ana Luisa Munoz Garcia, and then we are open to recommendations for who to invite in 2025. So please, as you're thinking today, send me a private message if you've got a suggested author or paper that you'd like to see us cover in the future. But today, I'm very pleased to welcome Ramzi Merabet from the University of Leeds, who will be discussing his paper, which is entitled Students We Label International, an Urgent Call to Reconceptualise Research with International Students. And I think this paper gives us a huge amount of food for thought to discuss. So I'm glad to have Ramzi here with us today to share some of the stories behind his paper. Just to say before we get started, as we go along, we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions, so you can indicate in the chat if you'd like to ask a question out loud, or else you can write your question for me to read on your behalf. And you're also welcome to send me a private message if you'd like me to ask the question to Ramzi anonymously. But to get us started, what I've asked Ramzi to do is to share a photograph that he feels represents himself as a scholar by way of introducing himself to us. So I'm going to get that up on the screen. And then Ramzi, over to you. Would you like to introduce yourself and explain to us why you've chosen this collection of photographs?
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Jenna, for organizing this. I watched the previous recordings of previous events, and I really enjoyed it. And it's good to get to know basically the writers behind the articles that I've read previously. All right, so jumping right into it, I chose a collage of pictures rather than only one picture. Basically, on a side, I'm a part-time photographer. From time to time, I used to do a lot of paid photography work before taking on a full-time job. So I obsess with travel photography, street photography, and right now aerial photography. So if you see a drone somewhere shooting something, then it's probably me taking pictures. So I chose 4 pictures, and each of them has a specific reason. So the one on the top left is one that my wife took of me in Scafell Pike. Scafell Pike is the highest peak in England, basically. It's sitting at around, I think, 3,000 something feet. We did this in winter on top of that, so it was one of the most difficult hikes we've ever done. We did this as part of a hiking kind of bucket list to spend 1 month in the wilderness over a period of 1 year. By the end of the year, this year, we have already done 28 hikes. So we are 2 hikes away from actually spending 1 full month outside in the wilderness in places that we have no control over, basically. This was the most difficult one for us and the longest one as well. On the right side is University of Leeds. It's the space where basically my life is shaping up and shaped up in the past as well. I've been in Leeds for like 7, 8 years now, and many things happened in Leeds. It's like my first time actually away from my parents. It's where I met my wife, who is now my wife. We were both students is the place where I decided to settle because I like the place. It's very close to the Yorkshire Dales, a lot of hiking happening there, and so on and so forth. So that's why I put the Leeds there to also represent the language center. That's exactly the building where we are based, the Parkinson building, and that's where my office is as well. Top or bottom left is a squirrel. So when people ask me about where you're from, my actual natural answer is that I'm from Meanwood in Leeds. I know that people expect a lot from where you're from because of my accent or because of the way I look. So they expect a country or some culture or something like that. But I always just disappoint by saying that I'm from Meanwood in Leeds because that's that's my local space now, and that's where I feel mostly comfortable. Over the last 3 years, we had like families of squirrels who visit us literally every day. And they kind of develop this tendency to visit us at very specific times. So they come exactly at the same time every time, and we literally have specific food for them. So we started this habit of feeding them when we saw that they go to the nearby kind of trash. There's a communal trash area, and we didn't like that. So we said, okay, what if we feed them? And then actually they started liking it and started coming. So they have a very good and varied diet. And yeah, that's what links me to that particular space, is that we have names for them as well. And we've seen squirrels becoming mothers, and we've seen the whole process happening as well. And we've seen squirrels fighting with birds, and we've seen the dynamics of group composition and territoriality and so on and so forth. On the bottom right corner is a picture of a cathedral in Vilnius in Lithuania. My wife is originally from Lithuania, and when I enter first the cathedral, probably people when they see a space, most of the time we think of difference whenever we see space. We think of how different is it to us. We never think about the things that actually are very similar to our immediate environments. I originally came from Algeria, which is a Muslim country, but when you enter the cathedral on a Christmas mass, you cannot but notice how similar practices are across different spaces. And I'm looking at what's happening during the Christmas mass, and I'm like, this is like literally similar to many things that happen within a mosque, but it's just that place is called a mosque and that's called a cathedral or a church or something like that. It's like, while we enter to a space to look for difference, we will always find difference. But if we enter without expecting anything, we tend to find way more than difference. We kind of find complexity, which is basically probably what I will focus on in today's kind of talk. Yeah, Jenna, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. That's such a nice introduction to yourself as a person. Let's kind of transition to talking about your paper. So just in case colleagues didn't have a chance to read the paper, or they'd like to check their understanding of your intentions behind the paper, can you just give us a really brief summary of what your key arguments are within this paper we're discussing today?
So I haven't read the paper recently, but I still exactly remember it because I read it multiple times when I submitted it. And the paper basically explored the realities experienced and endured by students labeled international. I'm strategically saying here experienced as something that someone is aware of and is actually doing, and endured as something that you don't necessarily want to experience and you don't want to actually go through, but you end up going through it just because you happen to be someone from a specific place or labeled in a specific way. So it explored the realities experienced and endured by students labeled international. So the research is initiated with skepticism towards the label from the very beginning. So saying that the label is not neutral, it's not like a value-free label in a way. So instead of assuming that students are international and conducting any kind of research that builds on this problematic assumption from the beginning, I instead opted to question what makes one international, whether the label is warranted, useful, problematic, ethical, unethical. So the paper is based on some findings from a bigger doctoral research project that took place, or that was finished last year, basically. The context of the research is UK higher education, particularly in the north of England, with a major focus basically on its current state as a neoliberal sector. When I say neoliberal here, it's that I just mean it as a sector where education is commodified in order to create some form of profit, basically, or money in a way. So the current context as I argue in the paper, is basically neoliberal. It obsesses with income generation, which in a way leads to the dehumanization of cohorts of students, and some problematic exploitative approaches as well within many institutions around the UK, unfortunately. So I try to look at the bigger picture, trying to investigate some of the mechanisms, I call them mechanisms, that maintain this status of neoliberal higher education, and then move to consider the actual experience as narrated by groups of PGR. So in a way, I'm trying to juxtapose what PGRs are saying against what the higher state of higher education is. Sometimes the narratives align, other times the narratives are completely contradictory. What seems to be happening towards basically the second part of the paper is a lot, but just to summarize this briefly. So the first thing is that what seems to be happening is that students are actually labeled international, but are not necessarily so. So many students come to the UK and find themselves as suddenly they are international. They used to be just student and then suddenly they are international. What does that mean? It's being researched in more detail now, basically. So they are not necessarily international. The label is not an indicator of a homogeneous group. Instead, the label homogenizes the group. So instead of saying that international students are a homogeneous group, we will say that the group of students are actually being homogenized under the international student label, basically. Second, the label is problematic, obviously, and comes with a plethora of deficit narratives, stereotypes, and inequalities. I don't have to say much, but if you put the sentence international students are just in a public space in a university in the UK, people will come up with all the deficit narratives you can think of. And similar findings could be seen in like Canada, the US, Australia, major basically internationalization destinations. Third, the label discourages research or researchers from adopting a critical stance towards it. When you go through the literature, especially the one positioned within the UK context, especially, we can easily count the number of times where researchers actually didn't take the label at face value. So the majority of research you would look at, it starts from the assumption that students are international, and then the researcher will try to look at integration of international students or acculturation or a belonging or whatever. So the assumption is already there that they are international, and then we are going to do something. Like they are going to do something or experience something. And when there is hardly any research that starts from the assumptions, like what does that mean when we say that, when we invoke the international label, for example? And then finally, it is facilitating, I argue, based on numbers, I argue that this label is facilitating this neoliberal higher education, which is basically normalizing a student as consumer approach. And that's leading to a worse state of dehumanization of cohorts of international students and even more precarious higher education sector. So even the sector itself now relies on the label being there and being used for exploitative purposes. I wouldn't exaggerate if like major universities, and by major, I mean major in terms of income, universities that make 1 billion, for example, like Leeds or Manchester making 1.4 billion, or UCL, I wouldn't exaggerate if these universities actually lose 3,000 international students per year. It will be catastrophic for them easily. So towards the end, I kind of reflect on this relation between having the label and what it means in terms of financial exploitation and how unsustainable the sector is in general.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a dozen points I want to follow up on, but maybe before we get further into the actual article itself, can you kind of put us in the position of what was going on in your life when you wrote this article? I know you've mentioned you were, this is from your doctoral research, but what kind of contributed to your thinking and led you to wanting to write this specific piece?
I think what led me to think about it is two things. The first thing is when I observed that the label is taken for granted in research. I mean, probably most people here would have read a lot within this area of higher education studies and internationalization. And in most cases, you'll find that international student is presented as a neutral label, as if it doesn't have any kind of implications when we assume that students are international, as if it's very normal for them to be international, as if they chose to be international. We tend to ignore innocently, not people are not intentionally doing that, but we tend to innocently ignore that somebody came somewhere else or traveled somewhere else and suddenly they got a label, so they were labeled international. So that's one of the observations, and being a student labeled international myself, I lived through the whole experience of being labeled as international and what it means to me. For some students, it would be completely fine. It's like they wouldn't think too much about it, especially considering how short-lived degrees are. So degrees like an undergrad would be 3-4 years, and postgrads especially would be like 1 year for an MA, 3-4 years for a PhD. But when you look at it from a researcher perspective, who's also labeled international, you can see that there is a huge discomfort. So I started conversations with colleagues around me. I remember at the time, while I was undertaking my PhD, and we realized that the label is problematic, that we are actually labeled international. We are not just international students in a way. So that's the first kind of influence. And then the second influence for me is it comes more from the area. So from the research taking place in the area, and especially the word culture and interculturality. So my main research interest is interculturality, and that's what I teach in university, or what I've been teaching for the last 7 years as well, and what I've been researching as well. The thing is that whenever you deal with students labeled international, there is no research that could escape the word culture. It's like probably if you count the number of times the word culture and intercultural are used, you would find it's like countless in research with students who come from different countries. And then interculturality is taken at a very like kind of superficial level, like it's very grossly simplistic. Interculturality is still equating nationality in a way, which is really problematic. So when you see the actual research taking place in interculturality, you realize that interculturality has nothing to do with nationality. Diversity has nothing to do with nationality. But whenever we deal with international students, we seem to link culture to nationality, which is like quite obsolete way to look at it.
Yeah, I want to pick up on your use of the phrase students labeled international rather than the more commonly used phrase international students. So why did you use that phrase in particular, and why do you think that change in language is important within research or practice?
So for me, I think students themselves find themselves labeled. So that's the first observation that I made, is that students do not label themselves, they find themselves labeled. So you come to a specific place, especially the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, and especially in these countries, you find that people are labeled from the very beginning as not part of the space. They are international students in a way. So they don't construct themselves as international, but rather find themselves undergoing a process of kind of imposed belonging in a way, as they say in the doctor research. So they find the label waiting for them. There is barely any room to negotiate it. Basically, nobody can just stand there and just spend their entirety of their degree saying like, oh, I'm not international. Why you keep calling me international? Especially one considering how short some courses can be. So when the problem is that when we invoke the label, we are taking a theoretical and methodological position. And this is something that's not written about yet. It's like when we invoke the label in research, we are assuming things from the very beginning, but we tend to not talk about it in research in many ways. We don't disclose that positioning of students at all. If one assumes students to be international, then goes on to claim they are following, like, for example, a postmodern or social constructivist approach, then that can be very problematic and contradictory theoretically and methodologically. So if somebody is saying that I believe in the construction of reality, and I believe that people should basically construct their reality in the way they see fit in and appropriate, and then the same researcher imposes the label on them, you are international, then that's already a big contradiction in research. So ethically speaking as well, there are many questions to consider there as well. When we invoke the label as well, knowing that it is loaded with deficit narratives and stereotypes, we could be indirectly reinforcing those narratives and not disputing them in any way. As I said, like international students are shy, or they lack criticality, or they don't have good linguistic competence or whatever. There are loads and loads of deficit narratives that are associated with being international, and then within the lower scale, associated with being from a national of a particular country as well. So when we kind of take the label at face value, we are kind of reinforcing those deficit narratives. This is evident in research that expects students to either, let's say, integrate or adapt or acculturate. So you would come across research saying the acculturation of international students, or the acculturation of the Chinese international students. It's like there is already expectations that somebody is different, they are other, they do not fit, and we are going to explore that basically. So there are huge assumptions that are not even accounted for in research or ethically within ethical applications in any way. Also, when we invoke the label, we facilitate neoliberalism within higher education institutions. I thought for a long time, I thought that people actually know how much, for example, international students are paying for tuition fee, but it's surprising that when you ask people, they tell you, is it 12,000? Is it 13,000? And I'm like, that's like a 2010, 2009 kind of thing. It's like, I just looked this morning, and an MA in linguistics is costing 28,000 pounds for 1 year, for example. So people are not aware of that, of what is happening, because we never ask and we never check, because we are not in charge of those things. So in a way, when we invoke the label, we facilitate this process of neoliberalism, where basically we're looking at education as a source of money. We normalize the reality that fee status is some form of passport game. So if you have the right passport, you get the right fee. If you have the other passport, you get the other fee, basically. And what pay depends on whether you are the self or the other. It's the biggest self-inflicted injury, I would call, we have in higher education right now. In a way, we are engineering this lack of sustainability, and then we are complaining about it at the same time. It's like we are accepting it and complaining about it at the same time. And then when we invoke the label, we don't leave room for the concerned individuals to either reject it altogether or decide what the label implies. So we kind of ossify, I like the word ossify, difference, then complain about it. In a way, we don't create room for people to construct themselves, and then we complain that they are not. Or it's like there is like, we are not creating room for people to construct themselves, and then we complain about it same time. So yeah, I think I thought about many like multiple reasons, but there are of course other ones.
Yeah, I mean, you've kind of got me wondering if we've named this network the wrong thing. But I mean, I guess I wonder, do you feel that a replacement of terms is a viable alternative? So like, is there a more ethical label, or is the act of labeling itself kind of at the core of this issue? Sort of thinking about, do we risk changing the name while the underlying problems remain the same?
Rest assured, the name of the network is not problematic. I was approached by a publisher who asked me to review your book, the open access
Oh.
book, and yeah, I thought for a bit, and I said no. It's like it's completely fine. They pointed to the point that, oh, look at the label, it's taken for granted. I said like, yeah, it's taken for granted, but it's still very critical pieces there. So yeah, that was an experience that happened in the past. I think for that question, is it the label that is problematic, or what we do with it? I would say both. So it's probably both, depending on what we're looking at. So as a presumed indicative category, what is international indicative of, and why? So why are people discursively constructed as national versus international within a supposedly equal educational setting? So from a neutral indicative position, the label is not neutral and already is full of assumptions that lead to othering. So you can easily make the case that, well, we have international members of staff. Nobody goes on saying that, oh, our staff are international and our staff are home staff. Like, nobody says that. It's not normalized. Discursively, it is problematic to put it in those words. So the language itself is already problematic. So the label and what it describes is problematic. And then second, the way it is used is also problematic. And I think here I would like to refer to three areas, because they could help us visualize why it is problematic. And while I'm talking about the three areas, I think people can actually imagine, oh, is that true? How can I see it in my maybe practice or classroom and so on and so forth. So the three areas are research, policy, and the classroom. So three key areas that within higher education studies, they basically are interrelated in one way or another. So starting from research. So if the label is accepted at face value within research, then it is engineering difference that either does not exist or does not exist necessarily as it is shown to. So even if people say that, oh, international students are different than home students, well, you cannot account for that in any way in research because you're trying to find out how. So why you're assuming from the beginning, for example. So whenever we are conducting research, the least ethical questions we need to ask are, why am I mobilizing the label? And what do I intend to achieve with it in some way? So somebody might throw the words like the expression, I'm going to do my dissertation around Chinese international students. Why? So why exactly Chinese and why international? So what's the relevance of the label there, for example? Or I'm going to do this research or this article about that. It's very, very problematic, very problematic. And I think I told you about this in a recent meeting, but I was reading this paper about belonging, and it was done by a group of researchers in Belfast. And the paper is saying that we are looking at international students' belonging in order to basically attract more international students and make more profit for the university. That was the reasoning literally written in the paper for that. So we reached a stage where it is normalized to look at people's being within a space or belonging within a space in financial terms. Because they are bringing in money, we need to find ways to make them feel at home in a way. So within research itself is really problematic. So taking that to policy, and I think policy is the most problematic because it's the hardest to challenge in many ways. You can change research, you can change the classroom. In policy, you will need, a lot of political decisions that go beyond you in a way. So it's the most problematic area as it's hardly regulated by research, especially nowadays. The issue originates from assumptions about difference and how assumed difference indicates access, rights, duties, representation. So, for example, international students in the UK, they have a lot of rights, but they have a lot of duties that are not duties, but like restrictions that are beyond what home students are basically expected to do. For example, that relates to their visas, to what they could do, what they couldn't do. So within policy itself, so who gets what and why are questions to consider here. At the moment, the label is mobilized to justify disadvantage. Why do I not have access to that? It's because you are international. It's like normalized within policy that because you are international, you probably wouldn't have access to certain things that other people have access to. Rachel Brooks writes a lot about access in higher education, and she also points to some of these disadvantages and questions why are they normalized, for example. And then the classroom. So this is, unfortunately, the classroom is where dehumanization, othering, and deficit can be created and can be reinforced as well. Here, the label is mostly visible through assumptions about students' attitudes and behaviors. So the label can be used to assume an inherent difference. International student X cannot do Y because of their country of origin, or something like that. So within the classroom, the label can be mobilized in very dangerous ways that we cannot see because people's assumptions are usually kept to themselves, and they are hardly questioned in a way. So the thing is that it's like if somebody assumes that international students are not equal to home students, that would dictate the way they will teach their classrooms and the assumptions they have about those classrooms. If somebody says that students from country X are shy or silent or lacking criticality, that would affect their relationship to that classroom. I recently had or heard a chat. We were chatting, and then two of my colleagues were talking about a student from Hong Kong and a student from China, and then one of the colleagues naturally and spontaneously, and I would say innocently, just said that, oh, make sure to not put the Hong Kong student and the Chinese student together in the same table. And then I'm like standing there, I'm like, why? Why are you assuming that people would look at each other through the lens of nationality or through the lens of labels. Why are you doing that? Why don't you just let the group dynamic figure itself out and see how people are sitting together? And then if you have questions or you want to raise queries around that, you can do that. It's like one of the things I do in my classroom is like around week 5, 6, it's like raise your hands if you manage to get to know everybody in the room. And then we get some people who have never moved from one group to another to see the other students or to get to know them. And then it kind of creates that dynamic that, oh, I should socialize and get to know other people, for example, because we all have comfort zones. Obviously, if you are in a setting where there are a lot of hidden tensions, where there are many things assumed about you as an international student, you want to be comfortable. One of the things that you would see in a classroom is that people from certain nationalities sitting together, people from other nationalities sitting together, that could be completely fine and innocent and natural, as much as it could be problematic in a sense. There are many discourses within the classroom that prevent them from actually exercising their agency in whatever way they want. Maybe they feel judged because of their language, or because of assumptions about their language, because of the label itself, and so on and so forth. So yeah, when we look at the 3 areas, research, policy, and the classroom, we can see how it could be really problematic to assume that students are international.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess something that I struggle with though is that, and I guess why I've continued using the phrase international students is that there are structures which render that categorization necessary, namely visas, and the ways that universities act as visa sponsors for students. So what would have to change to actually stop the labeling of students be labeled international?
I think we have expanded the labeling to areas where it's not warranted at all. So within an administrative kind of context where the label is used to invoke that something is or that a certain passport does not hold equal weight to another passport, for example, there is a lot of room for discussion that in migration studies and social sciences. But what we did is that we have expanded that label beyond its original context. So we tend to adopt the international label at face value within the campus entirely. We have dedicated, for example, things for international students where you realize that can apply to any student from any place around the world, not necessarily only international students. We are using the label excessively, and to a certain extent, we are abusing the label. And in research in particular, there is a lot of research that I would say could basically disappear without adding any contribution, because it's just milking the label to the point of basically being really, really ridiculous. In a way, it's engineered research that doesn't relate to reality in any way, because when you go to reality, you see the dynamic of group formation, and you realize that the label, if not emphasized and exaggerated and abused, can be very minimal, or its impact can be very minimal within group formation. But we tend to obsess with it and build research, build policies, build practices based on the label, which is a shame.
I think that's a really good line. You're milking the label to the point of ridiculousness. I think it's a good summary of a lot of research that exists. You're right. I want to ask a bunch of other questions, but I'm going to ask one further question because I can see there's already questions coming in, being sent privately to me and in the chat. So colleagues who are here today, if you want to ask questions, now's the time to start thinking about typing those up. But I think the final question I'll ask is about your paper ends with a plea for reconceptualizing research, which I think fits really nicely with the theme of this network. So can you share with us what in particular about research do you think should change, and what would a more ethical form of research look like in the future?
All right, so thank you for that question. It made me think a lot. The first thing I would love to see like changing or being acknowledged is language. So the language you use to describe people, regardless of who those people are. Unfortunately, the international label is a blanket that basically includes all sorts of behaviors and characteristics and people from basically all sorts of places. This approach is very problematic because it creates that binary of home international, and it kind of creates that imagined difference, that there is some inherent differences between somebody being labeled home and somebody being labeled international in a way. And by default, while we are homogenizing cohorts of international students, we are indirectly homogenizing cohorts of home students as well, which is a very, very bad thing to do in research. There's in most cases, there isn't anything special about being international apart from what the student wants to talk about or the student wants to bring to the researchers, basically, setting. So that's the thing, is that language. Why do we consistently rely on how somebody is? It's like you see the media, somebody saying illegal immigrants, and then within a research context, you find that researchers are actually being critical to that, saying that that's an undocumented asylum seeker, for example. People are very careful with the language used within a research setting. We need to be careful about the language we use, and the label is something that is not something to take for granted. It's because it's not something that we bring with us as international students. It's something that is imposed on us once we are in the UK or in the US or elsewhere. The other thing is ethical considerations. So if somebody is basically building their research around international students for the sake of increasing profitability of a particular institution, that's very ethically flawed. I think international students are already overly exploited in terms of tuition fees and many other things that we haven't even talked about yet. Like if you talk about accommodation and how international students are going through accommodation and how they are exploited by estate agents because they basically don't know how the whole process works, for example, and they don't know like what is normal in this. Is this normal? Is this problematic? What should I do about it? So ethical considerations within research should account for what are we doing with students, and why are we doing that with them? What's the intended aim behind that? In a way, if we are members of staff, when we see that somebody is exploiting us for findings or extracting knowledge, we tend to be very vocal about it. Why don't we do the same with students labeled international as well? And I think that's something that we need to look into more carefully, especially within the ethical side of internationalization in general. So representation, when you represent somebody as initially different or as inherently different because of who they are, where they come from, it tends to actually create some research that is what you envision to be the case rather than what is actually the case, for example. So if somebody says, let's say, Saudi Arabian students lack criticality from the very beginning, or builds a literature review based on that, that's a huge assumption that would affect the direction of the research. So all of the assumptions that we have around the label, the nationality is subsumed within the label, the expected behaviors, the expected kind of imagined culture of what the person is or who they are and how they construct themselves to be, all of those need to be questioned. I think it's like one of the things that I noticed when reading, especially higher education and internationalization related work, is that there is little connection to critical interculturality, where critical interculturality comes to say that nationality is not an explanatory tool. You cannot take nationality to explain the behavior of a person. That's very problematic. It could be even racist sometimes. But within internationalization research, that tends to be quite normal. If somebody goes and uses Hofstede to explain behaviors, like if somebody applies Hofstede on me, I'll be very annoyed. If somebody applies a Hofstedian approach on any scholar in the UK, they will be very annoyed. It's like, in a way, telling them that because you come from country X, your behavior should be Y. Why do we do that with international students? Why we assume because they just come from a certain geographic location that they would behave in a certain way? Or why do we say that when they behave in a certain way, we say that it's because of that geographic location? So either that side or the opposite side, in a way. It's like we kind of challenge homogenization, but at some point in research as well, we homogenize even more, basically. So yeah, it's like some of the things that that I'm looking at right now. The other thing is, I think the final thing is, I I think you pointed to that, is belonging, and how we look at belonging of students in general and international students. Unfortunately, belonging is the new buzzword now in university campuses. So I think it's decolonization and belonging. Everybody is doing research related to it, and AI as well. So AI is also a buzzword now as well. The thing with belonging is that people will revert to very simplistic cultural models to explain belonging and how students should belong. Somebody might innocently again say that because somebody comes from a culture that is different, then they would behave in they would behave in a special way. That's why we should accommodate that difference in order to create some sense of belonging for them. That's very problematic from the very beginning. It's like if you look at critical intercultural research, you'll find that's problematic. In my research, I talked a little bit about belonging, and that's a paper that is coming. The funny thing is that the model of belonging that I talked about in my research that I created there has already been applied in a peer-reviewed paper, which was published by other colleagues, but I haven't put my belonging model out yet, so it should be coming next year. So what it's like I will use the classroom as an example here, and everybody in this room, could you please imagine that you are in a classroom just to explain how my idea of belonging works, basically. So within a classroom, you'll be surrounded by people. The first assumption you will have is that what's your role in that place? So what's your position? How do you position yourself? And how do you position students within that space? What do you assume about them when you look at them? Do you take like facial characteristics? Do you take nationalities into consideration? Do you take stereotypes that you have in your mind? Do you say that the Spanish ones are going to do that, the Italian ones are going to do that, the Chinese ones are going to behave this way? If you're doing that already, that's a pretty natural process, because we all live through grand narratives that teach us some flawed and problematic things about people, that tell us that certain people behave in certain ways. So what happens within the classroom is that we are surrounded with three different forms of belonging, and that's assigned belonging, constructed belonging, and imposed belonging. Assigned belonging is what you grow up with. So when you are growing up, you grow up with certain statements that surround you. Somebody told you something about Santa, or somebody told you something about Prophet Muhammad, for example. Somebody told you something about what happens in a specific event, for example, in India or in China or whatever. All of those are statements that you're assigned when you're a kid. When you're a kid, usually you take things more for granted. This is how we do things in a way. As you grow up, you are constructing things. You could accept things. So you could accept that Santa Claus is real, or you can question that Santa Claus is not real, for example. What you're doing here is that you're constructing your belonging to the space. Sometimes when you construct, you accept what you have been told by your parents or your society. Other times, maybe you don't accept that. You challenge it and say, oh, I don't agree with that. I don't. That's why we are different as people, is that we construct our belonging to the space completely differently. And then what we do as well is that we have our assigned belonging from parents and society and our circles and our country. And we have constructed belonging, which we construct to either challenge or affirm what we have been told. And then we have the imposed belonging. So you could be sitting in your place doing nothing and being innocent, and somebody thinks that you are a terrorist, or somebody thinks that you are a very bad person, or somebody thinks that you are a very good person, or somebody thinks that you're a good lover, or somebody thinks that, I don't know, your language is good. So that's imposed belonging. It's like you have no control over that, but people impose things on you based on how they grow up as well, or what they see they think is appropriate or not appropriate. So within a classroom setting, all of that is happening simultaneously. A student from China grew up in a Chinese place, maybe in Shenzhen, for example, and they have certain practices. The person agreed to some practices, disagreed to some practices, challenged some practices, and then constructed their own belonging differently. They came to the UK, they are studying, let's say, in Leeds, and they are constructing their belonging in Leeds differently. If a teacher enters a classroom and doesn't see that constructed belonging and instead says, oh, Chinese students are this way, are shy, for example, then imposed belonging is defining the behavior of the teacher. The teacher is not even able to see what's happening in the classroom. We had a session last week with a group of colleagues, and I said, like, at some point, that some people go through thousands and thousands of students and they don't even get to know one student. They just get to know nationalities, because some people, when they enter a classroom, they don't see people, they see nationalities, they see flags. So you'll sit in corridors, you'll sit in meetings, you see people saying that, oh, I have 3 Chinese and I have 1 Japanese and 5 Koreans and you're like, what are you talking about? Are you talking about flags? Or you're talking about people? You cannot just describe people that way, as if, you count in socks or something like that. So yeah, we kind of impose belonging a lot, be it in research or be it in the classroom or anywhere. And whenever we impose belonging, we tend to not get to know who the people actually are. So as long as we are doing that, we cannot actually, in a way, it's like that research that follows that approach cannot actually reveal who people actually are, what their interests are, how they are different as people, and so on and so forth.
I'm going to take your words, because I feel there's a number of people I'd like to shake and say, you're talking about people, which is a great takeaway from this. I'm going to move us towards questions from colleagues in the audience. We've got someone who would like to ask their question out loud. So Begum, can I hand over to you, please?
Yes, thank you so much. This was a very insightful session for me, as per usual. Anyway, whenever I joined the Beyond the Reading sessions, it's always very inspiring. I'm joining from Turkey, is from Istanbul, from Koç University, and I'm actually a practitioner. So my question won't be really research related, but maybe speaking to your views on how campuses can be more not just inclusive, but in terms of this label, how we can go about it, because my literal job position title is International Community Services Specialist. So I'm responsible of students that we label international, but also researchers, staff, and interns as well. So all of them, we support them all with bureaucratic procedures, onboarding, etc. But when it comes to that, I know that in an ideal world, I also believe that my job position shouldn't exist. Technically, the university, all the different departments of the university should be able to serve all students equally, and I shouldn't be there as a bridge between the students that are either coming from abroad or have dual nationality. But since that's not the current state, we're kind of working on this label issue ourselves as well in the little way that we can, because in Turkish we have this issue where international students are called foreign students, and we're actually doing a lot to change at least our colleagues from saying foreign to international. So now and also stopping basically trying to say that local students don't have to be Turkish students. So there's a lot of label issues that are happening in our institution as well. But when we look at it, I do totally understand that just labeling international students doesn't help either, because we have so many, for example, dual citizen students that come up to us and say that I'm actually Turkish and I don't want to be grouped in as an international student. I don't want to be separated from the local students. And so this is now becoming more and more of a conversation. But I want to hear from you maybe like how we can go about moving away from having this one label in more of a practical sense, because they do have very specific needs that we need to assist with, whether it be bureaucratic procedures, but also, for example, like we work with the psychological counseling unit to have specific seminars or workshops regarding homesickness and things that may affect them specifically. But how do we kind of move away from having a label, but then also practically provide that support, but also kind of communicate to the other members of the university that there is a group of students that need specific needs that might be different than students who are local students? I don't know if I was able to say it clearly, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, and it's good to have you here. So the international community job that you mentioned is actually very relevant. So I wouldn't go about saying like, oh, it shouldn't exist in the first place, because while we aspire to have a space that accommodates difference, regardless of like where the boundaries are, we are affected by politics outside, global politics and positioning. So if you have members of staff or students or professional services that still look at people as international, for example, then your job is really important, because you are there to actually challenge those things and to say that international is not an indicator of some inherent difference. Basically, I think the practical thing is to start with what is being presented especially in marketing or promotional materials and on websites, for example, or how students are referred to and why they are being referred to that way. In some cases, as you said, you'll find instances where something applies specifically to international students, and in that case, the use of the label is completely warranted in a way. What you need to be looking at is places where it's overly used or abused in a way, or used in spaces that apply to literally every student. So feeling homesick or feeling that you don't belong to the space. I mean, home students for example, in the UK, they could move like hundreds of kilometers from their home city, and they are moving away from parents, and probably many of them first time actually moving away from their family, and they find that completely a culture shock experience. If you ask people very quickly, it's like, who gets culture shock? Home or international students? They tell you, no, it's only international students because they moved to a completely different country. Whereas actually, you could come across students who are really accustomed to different environments. You could find an international student who is very easy to acclimatize to any space, regardless of where that space is. Whereas you can find a home student who doesn't cope with that change very quickly, for example. So that boundary in many cases is imaginary. I think as in this role, I think you have an amazing opportunity to see how it is imaginary and try to question the label itself, especially that it stands for the word foreigner as well, in a way. If people, it's like one of the questions I have at university is like the core questions is that who owns the space? So when we look at the university from, let's say we are looking above at the university, who owns the space? So the word foreigner there already excludes somebody from owning any part of the space or making it theirs or shaping it in any way or constructing it in any way. I think the practical approach forward is to ask these questions: who owns the space? If students, regardless of nationality, can be part of that space and can construct that space in however way they want, then why are we assuming that they are necessarily different, for example? So when it comes to specific needs, we have many students with specific needs around the university. We have many students with a huge amount of needs. We never account for that. But when it comes to international students, we seem to prioritize that they are specific, they are special, they are different in some way. It could be from an innocent position that we are trying to cater for them in some way or another, but from another perspective is like it's an over prescription in a way. We're prescribing a law, we're assuming a lot of behaviors coming out from only certain people, basically. Yeah,
I think it's also the thing that you mentioned, which is very important, that really makes our lives difficult in this part, which is the policy aspect, because it's the bureaucratic procedures, unfortunately, that are so difficult for the students, especially that are coming from abroad. That does end up setting them aside, like for example, in terms of Turkish, like not to divert away from topic, but for example, if students are not Turkish citizens, they're not allowed to work on campus legally, and they can't, although there are part-time jobs on campus that we can provide to local students with Turkish citizenship, we can't provide it for those who do not have Turkish citizenship. So this is such a clear barrier. So then we have to then address that issue as saying that there are a group of students that don't have Turkish nationality that are facing this issue. And it's very hard to be a university member that is trying to kind of overcome a very government issue at that point.
Yeah, as I said, like the policy part of it is the most difficult question. I mean, Rachel Brooks does an amazing work talking about educational justice and social justice and how there are boundaries to those whenever we think about international students. So that's definitely a place to go to check how, because she talks a lot about policies and how policies basically shape experiences and realities of students, basically. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
I'll raise one further question before we run out of time, but another question that's been sent to me is about, you use the language of we label, but I wonder whether students are also labeling themselves as international students, and do you get a sense of whether this is imposed on them or if this is a label that students are embracing willingly? So might students have agency and choosing this label as part of their identity?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. So students we label international. The word we there, we could even include students themselves. So students we label as we is also students. So there are many students who actually take the label and say that I am actually international. If you check the article, there is actually someone who says that, yes, I am international. I should be treated as international and I should be getting special support because I am paying a lot of money, basically. There is very few pieces of research that actually look into this. For example, like why are there students who actually label themselves international? Why they label themselves international? What's the reasoning behind that? For me, when I look at the bigger picture, I always find that it's due to the fact that someone is being labeled, and with the label there is a lot of kind of special treatments that are constraining and restrictive in many ways. At the same time, they are told that you are equal. At the same time, they are paying a lot of money. That's why they keep emphasizing, oh, well, I'm labeled international. Why don't you give me the special support you're talking about? Why am I paying all of this money and then not getting that in return? In a way, they are adopting the student as consumer approach, and trying to challenge. Okay, yes, I am international. Give me more. I have some students actually adopt the deficit. They say, okay, yeah, I'm very bad with language, or oh, I'm not critical enough, or something like that. You have accepted me, you have admitted me into the university for a reason, probably most of the time it's the money in the UK setting. So, okay, what are you gonna do about that in a way? So yeah, we there, it's not just me or researchers or people who are not international, it's actually even students themselves label themselves sometimes strategically. Most of the time I see strategically in a way. So there's Gayatri Spivak talks a lot about strategic essentialism. Also many feminist studies and feminist research deals with kind of where somebody adopts the position of patriarchy, how they are being oppressed against just to get more rights. Basically, it's like adopting that what somebody is imposing on me, so for the sake of actually claiming more rights, for example. So yeah, there are students who adopt the label, but most of the time not at face value, just because they want to get something strategic with it, because they are not getting it.
Yeah. Well, I'm conscious of time, and I think that brings us to the end of the allocated time for the session. So please, colleagues, do join me in a virtual round of applause for Ramzi, which I think has been such a fascinating discussion and insight into his work. I'll just end by saying our next Beyond the Reading session is taking place on December 10th at 1 o'clock UK time, where we have Ana Luisa Munoz Garcia, who's talking about her paper, Outing Class in the Process of Internationalization. The link is in the chat if you'd like to register, but please do reach out for ideas about next year's speakers, and if there's someone you'd like to see join us in the future, and look out for an eventual announcement of future events. So thank you so much, Ramzi, and thank you, colleagues, for joining today.
Yes, thank you so much, Shanna.
Thank you.